The rule is multiple copies. And don't put them all in the same place. I've had this nightmare many times thinking, okay, my backups are all at the studio along with the masters. What if we have a fire tonight? And I lose my backups at the same time. When I started becoming neurotic about it, what I would do was I'd be recording, and then as I was finishing the session, I'd say, okay, where can I put it somewhere just to make sure it's copied somewhere else? And I just grab the most available hard drive and say, okay, there's space on that, I'll put it there. And then I'd keep going, and I'd have like 2 or 3 hard drives sitting by the computer, and then pretty soon I ran out of space, so I'd go buy another one, and then I'd start using that, and then before I knew it, I turned around, I had like 65 hard drives because I do so much recording and so much digital information generated. And I was just putting them anywhere I wanted to put it just so I knew I had a backup, just in case. The problem is, knowing you have a backup and knowing where it is are 2 different things. And I realized that even though I'd backed it up, I didn't know which hard drive the latest backup was on. I'm working on a project for months, and every night I'm backing it up, and I don't know which is my latest version. I was really in a mess. It took me literally a year to go through every hard drive, go buy bigger hard drives. I started buying 2 terabyte hard drives and taking these 500 gig drives, and I took them and I went through every one of them. And I said, okay, this is that project, Project A, and I'd take it and bounce it over to my 2 terabyte Project A, one folder. I go through all 65 drives, taking all of Project A and compiling it to my 2 terabytes. And then I take a second 2 terabyte drive and bounce all of that over again as a second backup. And then, being as neurotic as I am, I couldn't bear to erase it off the smaller drives. So I'd put it in a new folder saying, okay, that's been found, and back it up. So I went through every hard drive. Literally took me a year, and now I've got like 10 2 terabyte hard drives at least. And I didn't bother to do them by date. I did them by name. Then I've got my own personal projects, and I've probably got 8 terabytes of my own personal projects backed up in 2 places. I keep one at home, I keep one at the studio. And so I came up with the system that works really, really good. I've got one record drive. I record on that drive. At the end of the day, I went out and bought a temporary backup drive. So if my record drive is 1 terabyte, I bought a 2 terabyte temporary backup. And then every night, if I work on a project, I back it up on my temp backup. So I'm in that world where I don't have to do much except keep backing up to one drive, writing over the day before, because I always have the latest version. I don't do multiple days or anything, just the latest version goes over. Gets backed up on my temp backup. Then, when the project is over and I'm done working on it, unless the client wants to come back years later and do stuff, but if the project's really come to a conclusion, then I'll go ahead and take my record drive and put it on a long-term backup drive. And then I'll back that up at least once or twice. And then I take it off my temporary backup, take it off my record drive, and have it on my long-term drives. My long-term drives are now 4 terabytes. Now what I've done is I've got multiple ways of backing it up. I've got the short-term memories, and then I've got the long-term memory. And when it goes to long-term, every 5 years, I go ahead and reinstitute that and back it up on a new drive. It actually works really well, and I wonder sometimes whether I really need to keep the stuff going because some of these projects, the bands don't exist anymore. But I do just because I'm neurotic like that. After I lost my own projects, I don't want to lose anything anymore, ever. That kind of method is really great, and hard drives are cheap. Let's talk about arrays. They come in all different arrays, and they're usually used for big servers. And some of the bigger servers have 8 hard drives, 8 2 terabyte hard drives, all in a row in a rack. And there's RAID 0, RAID 1, RAID 2, and all that. They all represent different ways of storage. And RAID 1 is where the data comes into the backup and it writes it identically to 2 hard drives, or to 3 or to 4. You can determine what you want to do. And so it's always writing in duplicate and in triplicate at all times. So if one of the drives goes out, you've got it on another, and it automatically switches over. That's how Google keeps their stuff up. If a hard drive goes down, which I'm sure it does often, they've got raids happening to take over, and then they replace the new drive. The minute they replace the new drive, it gets backed up and gets identically copied like the other ones. It's a software I wanted a RAID system because I was tired of backing it up on one long-term drive, then bouncing it over to the other. And so I get these internal drives. They have this RAID system there that you can get. It's just a shell where you put hard drives in that are not in cases. It's got one input, and you can set it up for however you like. I have it set up so it writes identically to both. And then I copy it over to my RAID drive, and it writes it identically to both. Then I take those out, put them back in the static-proof boxes and the packaging, and then put one on a shelf and take one to the studio. So I've got it in both places, but it's easier to manage that way. The RAID 0 is the dangerous one because the other systems for using a RAID is not for backup. It's for when you've got so much data that one hard drive isn't fast enough. So if I'm doing a huge video project with more data than audio, it'll take my data and it'll write it to the first drive and then some data to the second drive. And so it ping-pongs back and forth with data. And so it's faster because the two hard drives are working in parallel. And so it only has to work half as fast to get all the data back to the computer. So the problem with that is if one of those dies, you lose half of your data and you're totally messed up. You got to be careful with what kind of RAID setup you do, but RAID 1 is the one that actually writes it onto multiple drives identically. And I thought at one point I would use a RAID as my record drive so I'd never have to back up. Unfortunately, they're not quite fast enough for Pro Tools to do that. They're a little slower because they have to write on two drives at the same time. Flash storage is very insecure, but it's very handy. Cloud storage is really nice because they do all of the backups and maintain it and do all the RAID for you. The problem is that to get it to the cloud, if you've got a lot of data, it takes a long time for audio. If it's just documents, that's easy. That's a small amount of data. A big record project or, like 10 songs is like 60, 80, 100 gigs. It's going to take days to get it up into the cloud and to get it back. Store in different locations, rule of multiple copies, one master, two backups. They say 3 times is the charm. Keep data together. This is another thing that people do all the time and don't realize that half of their project's on one drive and half of it's on another backup. Make sure you know where all of your data lives and make sure that all of that data is backed up in multiple places. Be consistent about your hard drive to backup, because I learned that lesson. I'm not going to 65 drives ever again. The other thing that I've learned that's really helpful, and people don't think to do this, but it's so helpful. Every time I open a session, immediately before I work on it, I save it as a new date. So now I'm working on a new version. So if I'm working in Pro Tools, I open a session, I save it as today's date. And then I can even have multiple versions of today's date if I wanted to. Pro Tools itself has an auto backup function. And I've set it for every 3 minutes. You can keep 100 backups in your backup folder in Pro Tools. I set it for 3 minutes because I figure 300 minutes is an 8-hour day, pretty much. If I want to come back the next day and go back to something I did the day before, I could do that. If you set it up for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, I work fast, so I could get to the point where there's a lot of things that changed in 10 minutes. And I don't want to be in that situation where, what was it 10 minutes ago? At least at 3 minutes, I can really get close to everything I do. And if it isn't everything, it's just one last thing that I have to upgrade from the previous backup. The last thing that I would recommend that I haven't done yet, which is a great idea, use Time Machine or Carbon Copy Cloner or Super Duper. These are all free programs that basically clone the hard drives, including all of the system information. You can do that. So clone your system drive and then clone your record drive for your data. And never ever record on your boot drive, because the program has to reference information in the program on the boot drive, and it could be at that moment still wanting to write or read something that is in your session. Your computer can't do both, the hard drive can't do both at the same time, and it'll crash. You can set up Time Machine so that it's set up so that it only backs up the new information on the hard drive, not the entire hard drive all over again. I've threatened to do this, but I haven't done it yet, is have a 4, 5, 6 terabyte, 8 terabyte drive sitting by the computer connected to Time Machine, and at 4 in the morning, it'll back up anything new on the computer. That's another way to do it. I'm pretty neurotic about it. Every time I touch something, I back it up. But that would be a really handy way to do it. And if you've got a desktop computer, not a laptop, my desktop computer has 4 slots for hard drives. So I've got a boot drive, a record drive. These are internally. A boot drive, a record drive, a backup drive in the computer that's like 4 terabytes. So the boot drive is 1 terabyte, the record drive is 1 terabyte, and then I've got to hold program and sample information in the third slot, which is 1 terabyte, and then the fourth slot is 4 terabytes. And then I've got Time Machine set up to run from the record drive to my 4 terabyte drive at 4 in the morning or whatever you could choose to back it up automatically. And then you just leave the computer on and it'll do auto backup every night. Last but not least, loss of data is catastrophic. Data recovery is hard if it's possible, costly, time consuming. So back up, and back up again. 3 is the charm, is what they say.